Hi, everybody. So, we've had a little break on the Emerging Proud interviews, but we are back with a bang because we have with us today the now infamous, I think, Chris Cole. So, most of you in this community will probably recognize Chris from his amazing podcast series, Waking Up Bipolar. And Chris is a coach and an author of The Body of Chris, a memoir of obsession, addiction, and madness. So I'd love to talk to you a bit more about the content of that, Chris, and your journey and what's kind of led to you doing what you're doing now. And you shared your story in an Emerging Proud blog a few weeks ago. And I was just saying to you before we started to record, I love the fact that you're wearing a love hat, because one of the things I really respect about you when I listen to you talk is the fact that you're not, you talk about how love is so integral in healing. And I was watching your Naropi University talk last night and was so moved because it's brave to be vulnerable and talk about love. I think especially probably as a man these days, you are an embodiment of feminine rising. And you spoke about how loving another in your wife, and then that helped you to love yourself, and that was a big part of your healing. So thank you for being here and sharing your love with us today.
Thank you so much. I feel it. I feel the love. The hat loves you. The hat loves the listeners. I certainly love you and the listeners. Yeah, I mean, love is huge, right? And I think part of the madness that I experience in the world when I look out my window or go out my door and actually enter into the insanity, so to speak, is I see a world that's built on a foundation of ideological love and yet is not embodying such love. And so it's a really topsy-turvy experience to wake up. And for me, the experience of love was a kind of quality or theme or motif of my psychotic episode and of my spiritual awakening. And I just saw how radical the impossible love that Jesus taught was. How do I love myself and others and God? I mean, that's kind of the charge that everything Jesus was about could be reduced to. And yet I live in a society that's very ingrained and enmeshed with a Judeo-Christian ideology, and so the disconnect is very painful. And so to me, like, the awakening is about that. How can I come into congruence in myself? And to me,
sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, to me, love is the only way to do that,
Yeah, and that's such a common realization, isn't it? When people have an awakening, we connect with the fact that everything is love. That is the ultimate truth. And yeah, so trying to integrate that into the world that you describe is the roller coaster. Do you mind, Chris, for those people that might be listening that don't know your background and your story, if we just rewind a bit and just go back to kind of what happened with you when you were younger? I know you talk about having had an eating disorder and addictions, using drugs, and kind of having a period of falling apart really before your episode when you were 18. Would you mind just giving a bit of background?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm trying to think of how far back to go and how deep to go into it, but I can say in a very general way that from my very first memory, I had a real sense that I was offbeat or strange, that I was wanting to, like, I'm watching all my guy friends play in the playground, and I'm wanting to like play house with the girls. And I was kind of a queer kid, to be just totally frank about it. Um, and yeah, and so to be this queer kid, and also to be in a setting of conservative Christianity in the South. I grew up with parents that felt kind of unified in their conservative ideology and Christian ideology, but my mother was raised Mormon, my father was raised Catholic, and I think they wanted to meet in the middle in some way. And I was like initially raised Presbyterian, and then we changed to Catholic at some point. And I remember the kind of strange quality of that, of trying to choose how to be Christian. I thought that was kind of an odd thing. And I was fortunate enough to have a really unbelievable mother who would say things like, well, it just matters that you love the way Jesus loves, and Jesus loves you, and all this kind of stuff. So I really had from a young age a strong affinity with the life of Christ, even though I didn't really understand why people were so divided on how to do that. And some of my earliest memories around the pain of feeling too much, of being too sensitive, had to do with eating and crying. Those are like the two things I remember the most. So I remember being told I had nothing to cry about, and that was very painful for me and upsetting. And then I also remember stuff like sneaking into the kitchen and eating food at the pantry, even as a 7, 8-year-old kid, and trying not to get caught. So this was something that was very present for me from a very young age, feeling too much and trying to manage these feelings on my own, not understanding how to do it, not having anyone tell me this is a normal part of life. I had stuff like my father would say things like, well, you inherited the male crying gene, or things like that, because I have a very sensitive father, very sensitive grandfather. And yet there was a kind of reluctance about it. It's kind of like the way it was communicated to me was like a burden that I would need to overcome. And then as I came into my sexuality as an adolescent, a lot of my confusion around being a fat kid basically was that I needed to lose weight in order to have sexual intimacy. And I was also questioning my sexuality during that time. And I was in such a conservative setting that in my mind, it was very dichotomous. I was either gay or I was straight. And I just remember being so relieved that I enjoyed kissing women and being with women, that this was like, uh, I was so relieved to have this be okay for me. And I kind of just dismissed the dilemma for myself, which is very sad that to look back on. And then I got into drugs, and I got into drinking, and I just remember getting in trouble a lot. There was a time where I totaled my car and got arrested, and I had to go to rehab and all this kind of stuff. And I remember I would sit down with my parents, and I would feel the pain of how much I love them and they love me, and also how unmet I felt. It was like this really interesting inconsistency for me. And a part of that was, we would sit there and I would just cry and cry and feel so bad for my behavior. And they would kind of ask me, well, why are you doing it? And I just couldn't access a reason. It was just like, that's just how much pain I was in. It was so unconscious. I just needed to numb. I needed to alter the sort of natural sensitivity that I felt. So I had a lot of masculine compensation. I was sort of a bodybuilder, all these kinds of things. And then when I had my first psychotic episode where I thought I was Jesus, and this was the premise of The Body of Christ, my book and the story, I I had this sense that I had a very intimate connection with God, and I therefore I must be Jesus. And the reason I actually like to say that was the most logical deduction I made,
Mm-hmm.
because from my spiritual and religious upbringing, Jesus was the only one that had intimate knowledge and direct knowledge of God. And so I like to say that was the most kind of coherent thing that I thought that day. But and then I got arrested. I was running around my dormitory trying to get disciples. I get arrested, and in the jail cell, I strip off all my clothes. And amongst other things, I start to demand that the officers come see my naked body to see that I'm neither male nor female, that I'm God.
Wow.
And that was like a snapshot of a very primordial pain.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Chris,
Who,
do you mind if I just kind of pause there, because there's so
yeah.
much like really vital, I think, information you shared that I think will resonate with, it resonates with me, and I think will resonate with the audience as well, because to have your emotions, your sensitivities invalidated as a child, to be told you shouldn't be crying or you shouldn't be feeling a way that you're feeling, is traumatic, and I think that's really overlooked. And I think so many people who are now sensitives and labeled and empaths are experienced that as children, and it's no it's not there's no blame, it's nobody's fault, it's not our parents' fault, it's just the way things were and the way that we were different coming into the world. And what you were saying about having to identify as either straight or gay, fit yourself into a box, I can really identify with that too. And it's like, now I'm like, okay, well, I don't have to be anything. I need to put myself in any boxes. It's about, to me, it's just about falling in love with a person, not, or a soul, another soul, not what body they're in. And I think that's really important thing to kind of validate for people too, and a really common theme that we share, I think, in this community. And then I just really wanted to also kind of highlight what you just said about, when on your awakening experience identifying as Jesus, because I think that is such a common thing that's heard in hospital
Mhm.
wards, in patient wards. I am God, I am Jesus. And it's like, I think you're right. It is like the most logical when we connect to Christ consciousness or universal consciousness, whatever you want to call it. Um, I'm really getting interested in the neuroscience of this as well, because a friend and colleague I've spoken to, that it really kind of, I was questioning this for a long time. Like, why do some people wake up and say, I think I'm Jesus? And why do some people say, well, I do, but that's a bit weird? They can kind of detach from that.
Mhm.
And she talks about how, like exactly like you said, the frameworks, that the conceptual frameworks that we're brought up with as children, we kind of make it fit, make the experience fit. But also the age that we have a trauma during childhood, and what stage our developing sense of self is at, and our where our brain is at according to the trauma, that also affects how we interpret the experience as well. And it's like, exactly like you just said, it's so logical when you learn all of this stuff and kind of put all that into the framework of what we experience. It makes so much more sense than
Mhm.
the labels, the labels that have been invented. And I'd really love to talk more about your thoughts on that, Chris, as well, maybe later on. But I just wanted to kind of really highlight those important points, because I think, you're speaking to so many people in this community with your experiences. So sorry, I will let you go on. And
No, no, please interrupt. Yeah.
I don't half ramble on sometimes. But I just get really excited because these themes that connect us all, it's just so beautiful. Because like you, I felt weird and an outsider as a kid, and was sensitive and pushed it all away, and ate
Mhm.
too much and all of that stuff too. So yes, thank you for being so open and honest. I love that. So okay, so you tried to gather your disciples, you got arrested. What happened then?
Yeah, well, I just want to say that I like being in dialogue the most because I think part of navigating what I consider a bipolar body is there's a kind of, to me, it's just the energetic boundaries and the psychic boundaries start to get a little, it's just less concrete. So it's easier for me to just kind of like go way out there, and it's like, oh, what am I saying again? So,
That's
so
cool. That's cool. And while you're saying that, it just came to me something that you mentioned in your blog that you shared for Emerging Proud. You talked about the great dance between form and formlessness. And I love that because I talk about the bipolar pendulum between identification with our spiritual self and our human self. And it's like, that so spoke to me. I don't know whether you want to say a bit more about that.
yeah, well, that's big, right? I mean, so to me, this form and formlessness, that's kind of the mark of Buddhist psychology and Buddhist thought. And I really love that because, like you talked about Christ consciousness and coming into that, it's like, how do I come into the Christ nature without being literally Christ, right? So there's to me,
That's a
Buddha,
bit of a tough job.
right? Well, it can be, right? But to me, Buddhist psychology sort of offers a map in that way, in the sense that Buddha nature, the idea that everyone has Buddha nature, to me, it was very easy for me to take that and interpret that and personalize that, in the sense that there is Christ consciousness in me, and we're all doing this. We're all negotiating our divinity and our humanity, and working out how to kind of bridge those together. And at times we really do have the insight into the inseparable quality of that we are divine humans, and that we're individuals, and we're also members of the collective. And so to me, this kind of transpersonal, maybe Jungian type of lens, where we're seeing the whole, or the gestalt of everything. And so that really helped me, and that helped formulate my thinking. I think the part where, for my story, picking up from the, I'm God and I'm naked, and my favorite punchline from the book is I woke up, and or I was born again, and this time I had my underwear on, something like that. I can't remember the exact quote, but so I wake up, and I'm in chains, right? I'm literally pinned to a chair of some kind, and my hands are chained down.
Wow.
And basically, what happened was someone gave me some kind of medication that I still today don't know what it was, because it was administered at the police offices, but injected it to me. And I thought, I mean, I was so out of it. I was in such a creative upheaval that I really thought I was being put to death. That I was being put down when he put the needle in my arm.
Being crucified, right?
Right, being crucified, exactly. And so to be able to see the archetype of crucifixion and all these things were really critical for me in my recovery. But what happened was, I spent a number of days trying to convince everyone that I really was Jesus, and then I was eventually taken to the hospital. And it was just unbelievably confusing time. And one story that I like to tell, that I think can sum up my confusion around it, is there was a nurse there in my first hospitalization. And after a few days of me taking medication, and I had already been put in solitary and defecated myself, my parents came to see me, and I was having I can't remember what it's called, but my whole body was stiff, and my eyes were rolled back in my head. And my parents thought I was gone. Like, we lost our son, and, but I started to come to after a number of days, and I remember him coming to me, the nurse, and saying something to the effect of, how are you feeling about these things? Do you still think you're Jesus, and I just was kind of like, well, sort of, I sort of still do. And the way he challenged my thinking was, he said, well, Jesus comes riding on a white horse down from heaven or something. It was some kind of scripture, right? And I just remember looking at him and thinking, this is messed up, right? This person would not know Jesus if he came and slapped him in the face. Not to say that I was, but just to say that this is the perversion of the paradigm we're in, right? That we have.
Yeah. And I'm supposed to be the crazy one.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this was always with me. And so when I was told, thinking you're God and grandiosity, and this is all part of the chemical nature of the brain and whatnot, I just, I think, like all of us do, or a lot of us do, if we make it out alive, quite frankly, is we become our own kind of philosophers and scientists and religious thinkers and mystics. And I just really started seeking out and finding little teachings here and there, piecemealing it together. And that continues to this day, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. That was going to be one of my questions, actually. What is it that, the things that have been the most helpful to you to kind of help to integrate the form and formlessness experience? Because you talk a lot about, when you became a father, and you've got a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old boy. Is that right?
Wait, say that again.
You've got 2 little boys, right? 6.
Yes. Right now they're 4 and 6.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, and I've heard you speak about, the fact that when you became a father, you knew that you needed to stop this pendulum swinging so much, right? So mm-hmm. I was really curious as to what techniques and healing models you use to help with that, and what you use now.
Yeah. Well, gosh, it's a big question, right? Because I actually don't have a fixed model of treatment, we might say, or healing, we might say. But what I can say so all the way back in 2006, I had an episode, and we can decide how we want to describe that for ourselves. I prefer to think of it as both psychosis and spiritual emergency. And part of that's just because I want to be inclusive in my language. I think that the part of the problem is splitting off, trying to distinguish.
Yeah. I had an amazing chat with such an insightful 20-something-year-old who's struggling with this journey yesterday. And, she said to me, and I'd love to talk to you about your perspective on this, Chris. I've always really, really struggled with the theories of differential diagnosis. Some things are mental illness and some things are spiritual awakening. To me, it's one and the same thing, and I think it's really dangerous. And she used this word, othering is really, it can be really detrimental. We are all one, and we're all experiencing, to my mind, a huge humanity awakening. Mm-hmm. But we all experience it in different ways, according to our histories, according to our ancestral histories, and our, whatever we've experienced in the past. So, and I know you're doing some work around that too, and relanguaging and mm-hmm. Creating new conceptual frameworks around bipolar. So, if we could go into that a bit too, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I think that will help me stay on track, actually, if I try to get from here to there in a line.
I'm jumping around all over the place. I get really excited.
Yeah, it might wind a little bit, but I want to be on that path toward that idea. Well, what was I going to say about the boys? Oh, yeah. So in 2006, I started being introduced and having a lot of wild thoughts and concerns about 2012 and the Mayan prophecies and the end of the world and all this kind of stuff. And this was a real focus of my energy, 2012. And it was so in the forefront of my consciousness that I had a kind of idea that I shouldn't be too invested in anything until 2012, just in case, and what ended up happening, it just so happens, and this is a great synchronicity of my life, is my first son was born on Leap Day 2012. And I felt like this is me coming into alignment with my confusion around form and formlessness, or divinity and humanity. And my son, and being a father and being responsible to my wife in a deeper way, because there was still ways for me to manage when we did not have a son, in the sense that I could sleep for long periods of time on the weekends or those kinds of things. And it forced me to be stable in a way that it wasn't about whether or not I was sick or well. It was about whether or not I could show up for my son. And it forced me to drop some of the theoretical qualities around my nervous system, my brain, wellness, sickness, etc. And it was really painful. Like I like to tell people, it was excruciatingly painful. At one point, my wife essentially said, if you can't show up on a more consistent basis, I'm going to have to go live with my parents until you can. And I still love you, always will love you. I'm not abandoning you, but just logistically, I need more help. And that put me in a space where I felt like I needed to find a way to make this work. And I went into what we might call the psychiatric system. I re-entered that system for the first time in my life, where I felt like I was choosing it. And I really emphasized for myself that this is a choice, that I actually could choose to not be in relationship with my wife, with my son. And the impossible heartbreak of making that work was another type of emergence, which continues today. So I might feel really irritable. And there actually was a time this week where I felt really frustrated. Like I had a schedule change, and I was having some kind of strange family dynamics with my family of origin. It's Father's Day, all these kinds of things. And yet I'm waking up to two boys that are smiling and are asking for engagement and want to play Legos and all this stuff. And so the crucible of forcing myself to reconcile my need for psychiatry and my repulsion of the way in which I'm viewed in that setting has birthed a kind of, or forged a kind of clarity around the difference between my neurological makeup and the pain of being in a body that has such a neurological makeup. Now, in order to unpack that, I can start using language, and we need language, right? And language evolves. And I think one of the challenges of our times now is that because of technology and the speed of the internet and connection, language is evolving even faster than we're able to catch up. So sometimes we catch up to a language and it's already endangered or extinct. And my thing is, I like to view, and you alluded to the video of my talk, I like to view what I enjoy now today as bipolar order, which is to be distinguished from bipolar disorder, which is to say that I'm bipolar whether I'm well or sick. And I really believe that, because I'm so sensitive to energetic shifts, sensory shifts, emotional shifts. You know, you and I are about to get on the call and I feel like an upsurge of like, what am I doing? Oh my gosh. Like, let's come back to the body. Because I have an ability on a spot to just dissociate or merge with whatever setting or idea is up for me. And so this requires a kind of mindfulness. So we talk about the healing and treatment model. So to me, mindfulness is so critical in the sense that if I can notice I'm on the ride, I like to use the analogy of that roller coaster where if I can see that I'm going click, click, click up the hill, if I can notice there, I can get off and I can take the stairs down. But once I hit that threshold, I'm off for the ride and I got to wait till this thing comes to a park, you know. That level of mindfulness and precision has to be held in the container of love, because if I'm precise without love, I'm in a kind of self-harm space. I can't get it right. No matter what I do, I mess up. And so this self-love, it's like it has to be there. There's no way it cannot be there, and for me to be healthy, you know.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I love that we've kind of come full circle, because that's what I said right at the beginning is, you know, I love the fact that you talk openly about that, the fact that, you know, self-love, self-compassion is key to healing. And like you described it, I think once we can embrace that, and it's really hard, isn't it, when you've had a lifetime of berating yourself and hating yourself, actually it's a real challenge. But once you can do that, you're much more compassionate then to the services, like you said. You can embrace more of, you know, psychology or psychiatry, or, you know, maybe people that we're in dysfunctional relationships with. Or so, Chris, I'm just noticing the time, and I'm thinking, okay, I would really love, before we wrap up, to get your vision on how, and this is a big question, so, you know, take it as much or as far or as close as you like, but what would your ideal system look like, mental health system, if it were to embrace, you know, these transformative processes rather than having these biomedical models of diagnosis? What would the resources, the services, the system look like to you? Or what would you have preferred your experience to have been met with, really?
Yeah. Gosh, it is such a big question. And it reminds me of an earlier question I didn't explicitly answer, which was who or how, you know, influenced you and things like that. And for me, I've always been influenced since a very young age by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the idea of civil rights, the idea of women's rights, humans' rights, to me, and I always have related this to your work as well. But this idea of turning the whole system on its head and questioning the fundamental assumptions is critical to me. And so when I think of moving forward, I think that psychiatry as a field, I think the fastest change we're going to have is to actually transform the already existing pieces in place. Because I don't know if we have enough time as a human species to tear it all down and build something else. I feel like I want to leverage the premise of, for example, do no harm. You know, doctors take a pledge to do no harm. That to me is like Dr. King leveraging the Constitution against the very government that enslaved his people. So to me, I see leverage there. I've never met in my entire life And of course, I'm young and I haven't met every psychiatrist out there, but I've never met a psychiatrist that actually believes that they're hurting someone. And to me, that's the most powerful leverage I feel like I have as a bipolar person, is I can reach out if I can heal the trauma, and it's serious violence, serious trauma. But those of us that do feel resourced and do feel, privilege is a complicated word, but I feel privileged enough to have the resources to heal the things that allows me to reach out and say, I see you. I know that this is an expression of love, and let me tell you how it makes me feel. When this happens, it makes me feel this way. I feel like I have to be able to love them into the conversation because they have the power. They have the power, and that's part of why I see a necessary movement toward reappropriating a term like bipolar, because my concern is that I would get so anti-label and anti-language that nobody would be able to find me, because the language that they're internalizing is the way that they then view themselves. And so if they're searching for bipolar answers, they're only going to find them from people that are invested in the disorder, the illness, etc., and not seeing that the illness exists in the space between me and my environment, me and the systems I'm participating in, the space between bodies. And so when I think of a future vision, I think of a lens in which we can see diversity in its multiversity, in the ways that I can draw a direct line between, for example, whiteness in America and mental illness, which is to say that we're invested in individual sickness separate from collective ills, separate from collective problems. So if I can draw the line between the idea of a sick person, which is factually incorrect, then all of a sudden everyone's implicated. And if we're all implicated, we're all in the same boat. We're all doing this together. And so the mad person is a reflection of me, whether I like it or not, on a very fundamental space, right? Mm-hmm. Practically speaking, no force. Why do I have to go get a prescription for a subtherapeutic dosage of lithium when someone else can go get a lethal dosage of Tylenol? That makes no sense to me, right? So some of the ways in which dominance and oppression of people that are inducted into psychiatry, it has been systematized, it has been institutionalized. There is no reason, for example, marijuana should be legal and lithium should be illegal. That, like, I just don't see how that makes any sense, So I'm fired up about these issues. I want safe spaces. I don't want therapists to feel like they are more legally bound than companies that are poisoning our soil. I mean, these are like huge, huge issues. So,
no, gosh,
fired up.
I love that fired up passion. I love it. You are like, this is Emerging Proud. You are someone who is emerging through your crisis, totally passionate about doing the work you're here to do. Most of us believe we went through what we went through because it's brought us to here to change things. And I love your vision of, and I think you're right. And I fought against it for a while, and most of us do go through that phase. But, by reaching out to those who see things differently with as much love as possible, to bring down the big defenses that come up when those in power are protecting their livelihoods or their whatever it might be. I agree, it's the only way. It's the only way to kind of really level out the hierarchy and educate, because if you're not speaking in the language, they're not going to listen. So I love that you said that. I love what you're doing. Yeah, and I think you're an amazing spokesperson for this. So, and you know, human rights, it's kind of what Emerging Proud is all about. I see this as a, you know, I've got huge visions and a big civil rights movement and new mental health rights movement. So the more of us that are saying the same thing, the more I can kind of see it happening. So would you give people some information, Chris, on how they can see more of you, more of your interviews and your work and what you're doing from now on?
Yeah, definitely. Gosh, it feels good to get fired up, you know. I think I think of I think of slowing down my speech so I can pass as a neurotypical person, you know. Uh so yeah, people can find me by visiting colecoaching.com and there or wakingupbipolar.com. It's going to go, their podcast page is on my coaching page. And yeah, hang out. There's like a link to a Facebook group, and there's a link to my book, a link to the podcast. I blog. I'd love to hear encouraging messages or messages of ways to get in touch and do more, get more involved. I feel like we're moving in a way that we're going to all start coming together, and there's a snowball effect. And yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's all about coming together and collaborating and having our voices as a collective for sure.
Yeah. Invisibility, right? We can't make change if we can't even find each other. That's my thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And sharing each other's work and platforms, and absolutely. I will share the links to all of your work below this interview, and look forward to seeing how your work evolves and doing more together, hopefully, in the future, Chris. Thank you so much for joining
Thank you so much.
and for embracing your vision and for doing what you're doing.
You're my inspiration. Let's say that. You've been very inspirational to me. I like to tell people I've never had an original thought in my life. So
Neither have I. I see it as, you know, we're positive dominoes. You know, that's what I love about this. Like people's work inspired me. Hopefully my work inspires other people. Your work inspires other people. It's like yeah, the more we can grow this positive domino effect, the better. So doesn't need to be it doesn't need to be new. It just needs to be, yeah, we're all saying the same thing and empowering.
thank you.
Thank you. We will stay connected, I'm sure.
We will, of course.